Hero Time, Chapter 45, Princely Lies. The next night found the trio investigating a tip Kevin had gotten. Jen had been a bit suspicious and had been right. It turned out to be a trap set by the DNAliens. Jen had turned into Spider Monkey and set upon their attackers, but they seemed better prepared this time. Jen was blasted out of the tree with a shriek, and a large branch that had been above her came crashing down, stopped inches from slamming into her face by a web that wasn't hers. She blinked, turning and finding herself face to face with another spider monkey. For a second, her mind flashed to Albeda, but this one was male. Though, like normal Earth chimps, that was only obvious because he was bigger than her by at least 20 pounds. His eyes were bright yellow, and he smiled at her as he helped her up. "Are you all right?" She nodded. "Yeah, thanks." His smile grew wider. "I really appreciate the save." "Of course. I could not leave a fellow arachnochimp in peril. Not to mention one with eyes like yours. Don't think I've ever seen eyes that color. You're quite striking." Jen laughed lightly, glad the fur on her face hid her minor blush. Well, thanks, but I'm not actually an arachnochimp." She slapped the Omnitrix symbol and green lights flashed, leaving her human once more. The arachnochimp gasped, and Jen hurried to explain. "See, I have the Omnitrix, which lets me turn into any one of 10 aliens. It's an honor to meet you, Gen 10. He bowed, and Jen blushed slightly. "My name is Simeon." Simeon, just Sim for short, even though he was a prince, was a flirt. Even as they were about to be crushed by the fortress's security system. "Not that I'm not enjoying the view, but what are you doing?" Jen shot a glare over her shoulder as she managed to shimmy the acid-spitting thing out of her pocket. One of the DNAliens had dropped it during their fight yesterday, and none of them knew what it was, not even Kevin, but hopefully it would save them now. "Get that! Spray it on the floor!" Simeon used his tail to do just that, and they both dove through the new-made hole in the floor. Simeon grinned and tossed the device back to her. "Quick thinking! Impressive! Where'd you get the DNAlien resin remover?" Jen caught the device as her brain kicked into overdrive. Simeon had claimed he didn't know what the DNAliens were. She pocketed the device and shrugged. Long story. The techie Simeon tossed off the bridge told Jen everything. This was a communications base. The crystal was its power source. Jen didn't know what made her more angry, the fact that Simeon had lied about everything from who he was to why he was here, or the fact that she'd believed him. She heard him shriek from the room holding the crystal and set the techie down on the bridge. "Wait here." She had a plan. Removing the crystal was easy for Chromastone. She stepped out of the room, leaving Simeon unconscious on the floor. The techie, who'd introduced himself as Lou, frowned. "You're not gonna let him take it, are you?" Jen shook her head, setting the crystal down and transforming back into her human form. She stripped off her jacket and wrapped it around the crystal to hide its glow. "I need a box. Something so he won't see what he's got." Lou nodded and rushed over to a nearby wall compartment, coming back after a few minutes of clattering with an empty toolbox. Jen pulled the DNAlien resin remover out of her pocket. It and the crystal were about the same weight. Simeon would never know the difference. She handed Lou the crystal. "Keep out of sight with that. He can't know he doesn't have it. And we're probably gonna need a ride home." "There's a spare pod you can use, Miss Tennyson?" She grinned at him. "Thanks. Now get out of sight, quick, before he wakes up." She stashed the resin remover in the box and clicked it closed. Lou grinned and nodded, scurrying off. Kevin popped his gum. Jen and Sim had been getting along really well, and he didn't want to interrupt. The arachnochimp had been flirting up a storm since minute 1, and he'd seen stranger couples. So when Simeon came racing back around the corner without the brunette, Kevin frowned. "Sim, where's Jen?" "Right behind me." But as Kevin glanced back, there was no other figure coming around the corner as Simeon closed the hangar door, beginning to pull his suit back on. Kevin only hesitated for a moment before he pulled out his badge to track Jen. She was deeper in the facility, and she wasn't moving. Shit. He clicked the device over to the comm channel, knowing Gwen had her badge on her for missions. "Gwen, get in here. Something's wrong." Not even waiting for a response from the redhead, Kevin took off towards the little red dot on his badge that was the Omnitrix user. He had to backtrack twice, Gwen catching up to him quickly despite having taken off her suit. "Simeon's gone, and he took the ship. We're stuck." "You're not." The voice was unfamiliar and had both teens spinning, battle ready. The small green alien who'd spoken raised his hands. "Don't shoot!" "Chill, guys." Jen's reprimand had both of them lowering their fists. The small green alien turned to the doorway Jen's voice had come from, looking concerned, and it was then that Gwen noticed what looked like an ice pack in one of his hands. Jen stepped slowly around the corner, one hand on the wall, one hand pressed to her head. Gwen rushed to her cousin, Kevin, hot on her heels. "What happened?"
"Simeon,"
Kevin hissed, wishing he'd beaten the arachnochimp to a pulp.
"Shit, he got away with the crystal."
Jen laughed. "Nope. He got away with the DNAlien resin remover." They blinked at her. "The ear-cleaning looking thing. Simeon knew what it was, even though he said he didn't know what the DNAliens were." The small green alien stepped over to the trio, holding out the ice pack to Jen. "You shouldn't be standing, Miss Tennyson. You're hurt." Jen grinned at the alien, trading the ice pack in his hand for the bundled jacket that had been under her arm. She pressed the ice pack to her head as she leaned on the wall. "Thanks, Lou. I'll be fine." She did take his advice, though, and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. "If you could put that back where it belongs, that would be good. Simeon should be out of range by now." Lou nodded and scuttled off as Gwen looked over her cousin. "You let him knock you around so he'd get away with the wrong thing." Jen nodded and winced, and tilted her head back against the cool metal of the wall, one hand still holding the ice pack to the blossoming bruise on her face. "Yep."
"You okay?"
Kevin asked, looking her over. There was webbing on the Omnitrix and an impressive bruise growing on what he could see of her back beyond the collar of her shirt. It matched the one on her face quite well. "Didn't expect him to pack quite that big a punch. I'll be fine once I get the webbing off the Omnitrix. I'll just turn into swamp fire. She heals fast." Gwen nodded, and a flash of pink had the webs falling from the Omnitrix to the floor of the station. Jen grinned and set down the ice pack, spinning the dial and slapping it down, but it wasn't swamp fire sitting before them when the lights died. "Since when do you have an Apollonite form?" Gwen asked, eyeing her cousin's marble skin twinkling with green energy beneath it. Jen looked down, frowning. "It hasn't done that in a while. Given me the wrong alien, I mean." She raised a hand to her head and green lights glowed. She grinned and Kevin reached out a hand to help her up. "To answer your question, I've had it since Albrasix kissed me on the Incursion warship. The Omnitrix is taking DNA samples through me again." Kevin blinked, but Gwen seemed to know what her cousin was talking about. "Like when you got bit as Wildvine by that werewolf alien." "Exactly." Kevin shook his head, laughing.
"That sounds so wrong. I hope you both know that."
Jen shook her head as she slapped the Omnitrix symbol near her shoulder and turned back to normal. Her bruises were gone. Gwen shoved Kevin playfully. "So, Simeon got away. How are we getting home?" "Lou is lending us a pod." The lights in the station brightened and Jen grinned. "And we successfully tricked not just Simeon, but the hybrid who hired him. All in a good day." Kevin laughed.
"Only you could call it a good day when you get your ass kicked."
Jen laughed. "I meant to get my ass kicked, thank you very much. Just maybe not that much." She scooped up the ice pack and the three of them headed off to find Lou and the offered pod to get back to Earth. Chapter 46. Tiny Truths. Hearing a tip about a monster rampaging around a nearby town was par for the course for Jen, Kevin, and Gwen. Finding a smashed-up traffic light was a bit unusual, but not enough to raise alarm bells. The alien they found made things weird, especially because she seemed to want nothing more than to play with Jen and Gwen.
"There were so many pretty things in this place, shiny pretty things. The pink lady was pretty and sparkly, but the green lady had lines and circles all over her. She looked like one of the tools Da sometimes used. Maybe she could fix Ma and Da. But she didn't seem to like being picked up. The dull boy really didn't like it when the shiny ladies got picked up. He threw rocks. She didn't like the dull boy."
Gwen was sitting in Kevin's garage the next day. They'd hidden the giant alien baby here. The 8-foot-tall toddler's head was currently resting in Gwen's lap, and across her legs while she rested. It wasn't quite sleep, since her eyes remained open, and she seemed to be fully aware every time Gwen tried to move, so the redhead was reading the book Albrasix had given her instead. She had run across an interesting spell. It was a way to see through someone else's eyes. Not very practical, as you had to maintain skin-to-skin contact with whoever you were using the spell on, but it was interesting. She wasn't going anywhere for a while, so she decided to try it. She laid her open palm gently on Tiny's head and spoke. Skullbrassic Sven. Her perspective shifted, as though she was watching a video with picture-in-picture. Her own view of the world minimized to the corner as the door of the garage opened, letting in overly bright sunlight and Jen. Gwen stared. Her cousin's skin was laced with lines of circuitry, like she was the motherboard of a computer. There were 3 brighter points that stood out as though they were the main power sources for the lines of pulsing green code. Her heart, her brain, and the Omnitrix. The circuits pulsed along with the brunette's heartbeat as she turned to her fully. Her eyes were almost normal, if it hadn't been for the glow that blared from within them. Gwen pulled her hand off Tiny's head and broke the spell, blinking away the afterimage of what she'd seen. You okay there, cuz? You look a little freaked out. Gwen shook her head. I'm fine. She really hoped she didn't sound as shaken as she thought she did. If the Omnitrix lit up like Jen's brain and heart, what did that mean for her cousin? Did it mean that the watch was as important to her survival as the heart that pumped her blood or the brain that kept everything working? The thought terrified Gwen. She remembered how many times bad things had happened to the watch when they were kids. From Jen messing with it until the face fell off, to Kevin and Vilgax teaming up and ripping it from her wrist. Tiny burbled at the redhead, seeming to sense her distress. She gently patted the baby on its massive head, hoping Jen would prove oblivious enough to not notice her cousin's mood. Jen had never been good with emotions, after all. I'm fine, she repeated. Jen frowned like she didn't really believe her. Gwen changed the subject quickly. How's Kevin? Pouting that Tiny took a bite out of his car. Jen laughed, then her eyebrows knit together. Are you two doing okay? Jen handed Gwen a burger from the bag she'd brought with her. Gwen laughed. Oh, we're doing fine. He's just mad Tiny ate his car. Jen's grin turned wicked. That, and I bet he wishes it was his head in your lap, not hers. Gwen laughed as she flipped her cousin off. Jen snorted as she took a bite of her own burger. Gwen still hadn't lost the gnawing doubt by the time they were bidding farewell to Tiny and her parents. The 2 adults were easy enough to speak to. Her mother laughed as Tiny reached out both hands to Gwen and Jen, making grabby hands and babbling. No, darling, you can't keep them. Humans need to roam free. Shiny, Tiny insisted. Yes, they are very shiny, but you can't keep them. Kevin frowned as Tiny pouted.
She never did that with me.
Jen snorted. Kevin sounded almost disappointed. Tiny's father smiled.
Of course not, dear. You're an osmosian, a conductive species. Your life force isn't nearly as bright as theirs. She's nanotite, after all. Some of the brightest beings in the galaxy, he said, motioning to Gwen. And she... He frowned as he looked over Jen. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar.
Gwen winced, and Jen shrugged, waving the Omnitrix as Kevin frowned. Probably just the Omnitrix confusing her. The mother shook her head. Oh no, dear, you're a techno-organic, like Asmus mechamorphs. Jen blinked. This time, Gwen's flinch was quite obvious. Kevin frowned. Well, I mean, Asmus made the Omnitrix, but I'm human. Jen floundered, looking down at the watch. Oh, Asmuth's creations always take on a life of their own. That fancy sword of his could almost be called magic. Jen frowned. Sword? What sword? The father checked a console.
That was a long time ago. I honestly don't remember the story of that one. It's missing last I checked, isn't it, dear?
His wife nodded. Last time I checked. We should be going if we want to get to Alpha Proxima anytime soon. Jen was silent as Gwen bid farewell to Tiny. Jen waved at the baby alien, too, and managed to smile for the child, but it vanished as soon as she turned away. The trio watched as the ship blasted off into space. Jen stayed eerily quiet as they drove back to Bellwood. She spoke only once they'd reached her house. Did you know? That the Omnitrix... She couldn't seem to find the words she was looking for. Grandma Verdona hinted that might be the case. She never said it outright, but you know how I can sense auras? yours has always been green, ever since I got my powers. Grandma hinted that the Omnitrix was why, but you know that doesn't change who you are, not in the slightest. Jen nodded, but she wasn't looking at Gwen. Gwen reached out, but Jen pulled away before she could say anything else. Thanks for the ride, Kevin. Jen stepped out of her car and shoved her hands in her pockets, making her way up to her front door. Gwen hopped out of the car. Jen, wait. The brunette shook her head. I'm fine, Gwen. I just need some time to think. Gwen didn't believe her cousin, but Kevin put a hand on her shoulder.
Give her a bit of space. It's a lot to process. Everything she thought she was is wrong. She needs some time.
Gwen stared down at her hands and nodded as Jen's front door closed behind her. She got back into Kevin's car, and the Osmosian drove her home.